Hello and welcome back to the latest episode of the Publisher Podcast from Media Voices. I'm Peter Houston.
And I'm Esther Thorpe.
And this week's guest is Toby Moses. He's head of newsletters at The Guardian. I mean, Toby was great. He was very honest and very practical, which was brilliant. He's been the newsletter lead at The Guardian since 2021, and he was the first person in that role, which I described in our conversation as a blessing and a curse, and I think he agreed. I mean, it was really interesting to speak to him about how just those 5 years, there was no real unified newsletter strategy at The Guardian. And just listening to him talking about how far newsletters is this kind of central format, and that's not just at The Guardian, how far they've come in that time. It was interesting because, I don't know, sometimes it feels like forever and sometimes it just feels like not that long. I don't know if it's a COVID thing, but I mean, I've just finished judging our newsletter awards, which was amazing. And they're really now a central plank of that subscriber acquisition and retention piece. Some of the comments around that were really, really interesting.
And I think this is one of the really interesting differences we've seen in how, because we've been doing the podcast awards, so this is our 7th year of them, and I think it's our 4th year of the newsletter awards. And it's really interesting to see how publishers have evolved their approach to them since we've been running. Because like early on, there was, sort of pre-2020, there was this massive rush to podcasts. Publishers were like launching and experimenting, but there wasn't really much additional resource or investment or like audio teams. Like very, very few publishers had audio teams, except maybe the largest, FT, Telegraph, people like that.
Immediate really went for it, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. And I think that pays off. I think the people that are still around and still doing it really, really well are the ones who did invest. But there were a lot of editors who are like, okay, so do we just, get on Skype and have a crack at it? There's definitely a contraction in the podcast market. We can talk about this more another time. Like there's almost no launches now. The publishers are being a lot more cautious. And it's not that it's not paying off, but it's not brought many of the promises that it maybe did in the early days. And newsletters have had their rise. They had their rise a few years later. And I think probably from what we've seen from entries, it's still rising. I know people have said, oh, when's the newsletter bubble bursting? Well, it's not yet. But there's been a real kind of strategic consideration for a lot of publishers. Yeah, newsletters aren't new. People have had them for decades. Yeah. There's been a real strategic shift in how they think about them. Yeah, there's been some really careful hiring. And I think both products have fallen under the purview of editors. But I think newsletters and that editorial, that sort of written format come a lot more naturally to editors rather than podcasting, which is a whole different skill set. I mean, then obviously it's way cheaper to spin a newsletter up and wind it down if it doesn't work. Monetization is way easier for advertisers. And of course, the metrics to do things like measure, does this newsletter subscriber convert to a paid subscriber, are actually there.
Yeah, but still weird.
Still
weird. I think the metrics are still weird. One of the most interesting things for me in listening to Toby was the work he had to do at the beginning to try and convince people, Guardian's editorial management, I guess, that newsletters were actually worth the effort. There's this whole thing where, you remember those newsletters, you still see them, but everyone had them in the past where it was just a big, long list of automated links.
Yep.
They were just scraped off the website and fired out. And that idea of convincing people to switch to what Toby calls written through newsletters, so actual crafted editorial products. It was interesting listening to him talking about the work that he had and to get that, the idea that, we're going to do these newsletters and people will read them in the inbox rather than seeing it as a traffic driver.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest change. And also putting individual journalists front and centre. He talks about the responsibility of sort of saying, well, here's this person that's going to be the first point of contact for The Guardian every single morning at 7:00. And just that idea that you're kind of, I think the way I put it was you're subsuming the masthead to an individual. That was an interesting little part of the conversation.
I mean, The Economist has been fascinating with this, right? They edged into it with podcasts and newsletters, and now they suddenly realised that actually they can't have this like decades-long anonymity across the publication that they thought they could, because that's just not the way that you build relationships these days.
Toby was really honest about the learning, learning on the go, basically, developing best practice almost on the fly. He gave a great example around the digital detox series. Do you remember that? Reclaim Your Brain series?
I did that series. I thought it was brilliant. It actually, it cut a lot of my social media Instagram time.
Well, what he was saying about that was it was incredibly successful, but they hadn't necessarily thought through what they were going to do next.
Yeah.
And if he was doing it now, he would do it very differently. And he used the example of what they're doing. One of the things that they're doing for the World Cup is a series called Behind the World Cup. And it's targeted at US audiences who typically don't know as much about World Cup history or football history. But learning from the Reclaim Your Brain thing, they're actually planning now, okay, well, what next? So people sign up for Behind the World Cup, then they move them to the World Cup soccer desk, and then the idea is to move them to Soccer Desk Weekly. So there's this transition. One of the things he talked about there was data privacy, which is a really big deal. So how do you actually do that on a limited series? I mean, my big takeaway from talking to Toby is that the idea of experimentation is just, it's built in, it's baked into the whole process. There's no hard and fast rules. When it comes to formats and even metrics, the perfect newsletter, well, we kind of got into the idea that there is no such thing as a perfect newsletter. It's trying stuff until it works or it doesn't. But, if you are going to try and, frame the perfect newsletter, it's one that readers really respond to.
So talking about the US and soccer and all the other stuff that goes on, your related story this week is how UK news is winning in the US. And I mean, it's obviously a great interview to have on, given The Guardian in the last couple of weeks has had absolutely stunning US results.
Yeah, the timing was good.
So there's a story from our very own Colin Morrison, our boss at Flashes and Flames. Woo-hoo. He's looked at how UK legacy media keeps kind of leaping across the pond and seeing success over there.
Yeah, I mean, he leads with the Guardian's success, or the Guardian's US success. I suppose I had thought about this, but I don't think I thought about it in any depth. He's not saying it, but he's kind of acknowledging that people are talking about the Guardian's US operation as the main global competitor to the New York Times.
Yeah.
This is fascinating, right? So the Guardian's biggest digital audience is now in the US, and it's got about 200 people, all digital, generating something like 20% of their total revenue. And is the fact that it's all digital means that it's, the revenue is not anything near print, so it's about 30% of non-print revenue. And it's up in the US, its revenue in the US is up 30% over the last 2 years, forecast to grow another 25% by 2027. So yeah, amazing.
I spoke to Liz Wynn a couple of weeks ago. She's speaking at our Publisher Summit, and I kind of had an opening briefing call with her. And I said, well, it's great what you're doing in the US. And she said, one thing you have to bear in mind is that when you're a UK publisher walking through the US, you are walking through a graveyard. Like, there are a lot of places that have tried to have a US push that have not succeeded. Yeah. So it does actually take very, very careful planning, very, very careful strategy. And she's like, yes, it's a big open market, but it's a big open market where a lot of people have spent a lot of money and failed.
Well, Colin actually leads on that with some of the failures, EMAP in particular. So yeah, I guess you've got to be realistic. I talked a little bit to Toby about this. You've got the kind of refugees from outlets like OAN and Fox News and whatever looking for a sensible liberal outlet, so the Guardian ticks that box. And, the Guardian in that sense is branded brilliantly with the whole donor push and all the rest of it. As Colin describes it, it's become like a cause for people, which is a great thing for a newspaper to be, right? Join our cause, fight Fox News. I'm sure the Guardian doesn't use that line, but we all know, we're all thinking it.
Well, you've got all the stuff with Washington Post that's fallen apart a bit as well. So it's that left-leaning, but
I forgot.
Still rigorous publication. And there's a lot of people that don't want to support Jeff Bezos anymore.
I mean, the positive note is that's just bright future for UK news in the US market. And again, he says, Colin talks about this being positioned against the New York Times. And again, I hadn't thought about this, but the New York Times as a global brand is always going to struggle because it's the New York Times.
It's literally geolocated, yeah.
Whereas The Guardian or The Telegraph, and Colin talks about The Telegraph under Axel Springer, or The Independent, he talks about The Independent. So none of those have got that geography tied to them where the New York Times does. So yeah, interesting, really, really interesting.
And another shameless plug, as I've mentioned, I've had a chat to Liz Wynne, who is The Guardian's Chief Supporter Revenue Officer. I spoke to her because she is joining us at the Publishers Summit on July the 8th in London, discussing how investing in their apps, newsletters, podcasts, hiring people like Toby has paid off in both audience growth and revenue. She will also be touching on their US success too and some of the differences in product strategy overseas. Publishersummits.com is where you can get your tickets. We will see you there.
Woohoo! So back to the interview with Toby. As I mentioned at the start, Toby is The Guardian's first head of newsletters. And I started by asking him to tell me what that actually means. What does the head of newsletters at The Guardian actually do?
That's an interesting question because I was the first person to have this role at The Guardian.
Oh, right. Nice.
So when I started in 2021, I think it was, there had never been a head of newsletters at The Guardian, and there had never been someone in editorial who was taking hold of thinking about newsletters as a whole, as a strategy. There had been newsletters and there were successful newsletters, but they had popped up kind of organically as and when desk editors thought it might be interesting to do things. And a lot of them were just lists of links kind of replicating bits of the website. A lot of them were automated, so just scraped from the website. So I was brought in essence, to kind of shape my own job. The first part was coming up with a strategy for what newsletters should be at The Guardian, what that should look like. Looking at what was happening at the time, I wanted to angle it more towards coming up with written through, authored newsletters, creating that human connection between our writers, our journalism and our readers, rather than just replicating what was on the web already. So the shift in focus was moving from seeing newsletters as a referral tool, I suppose, to thinking about it as content, as journalism to be enjoyed on that platform itself. We came up with a strategy. We came up with some newsletters we wanted to do. I built a small team from scratch. The first thing I launched actually was a newsletter called Techscape, which was a tech newsletter. At the time, it was written by Alex Hearn, who was our technology correspondent then. And that was written through, and we used that as a kind of experiment to see, could this work? That grew pretty quickly and was still going now, run out of the US actually now, since Alex left. And yeah, from there we kind of grew, we moved on. The big thing we launched was First Edition, which was a kind of relaunch of the morning email that already existed, which had been written out of Australia for the UK, but was very much just to kind of flick through the headlines, written very nicely by Warren Murray, who was doing it out there for us. But we wanted something which was written by a more established UK name, a journalist with big experience. So we brought in Archie Bland, who at the time was very senior editor on the news desk. And he, with Nimo Omo, who at the time was the Young Journalist of the Year, who we brought in from Tortoise, they wrote the First Edition newsletter together. And then it became my job to edit that, along with editing other newsletters produced out of the UK, like Techscape, Pushing Buttons, which is our gaming newsletter, Down to Earth, which was the environment. So it was about launching and relaunching a load of newsletters around lots of different subjects.
One of the things that really stands out in your answer to that first question is the number of people that you've mentioned, the names. How much was what you were trying to do at the beginning about bringing people and bringing personalities in?
It wasn't so much about bringing personalities necessarily. I know that is a way that a lot of the newsletter ecosystem has grown, is by leaning on those big names and using those to grow the audience. I think we've got a slight advantage in The Guardian in that we already have quite a very big web audience. And what we wanted to do was create relationships with those people that were more enduring, and newsletters are a really great way to do that. And so we didn't need to lean so much on the big names. We could lean on the kind of pillars of the great journalism we were already doing. And actually, a lot of what I was doing at the start was more selling it internally, I think, to make people in the building realize how important newsletters were to what we were doing commercially, but also how exciting they could be as a journalistic tool, because they allow writers to stretch their legs in a slightly different way and to write in a slightly different way, which I think has been very enjoyable for a lot of them.
What was the resistance? Was it about investing in something that wasn't tried and tested, or was it about, oh, newsletters, that's not important to us? Where did that resistance come from?
I think there's a bit of both. There's a bit of, because they hadn't been prioritized previously, there's a bit of, oh no, this is just this thing that had, they're not very interesting. They're just links from the website. Why would we bother putting time into that? It wasn't seen as a significant thing at The Guardian. And then also just, everyone's very busy. We all work very hard. And then the idea of someone coming along and being like, hey, come, why don't you do this other thing as well on top of all the other work that you're already doing? And a lot of, I think, what I was trying to say to people is that you don't need necessarily to do more work. Is there some of what you're doing already that could be written in a slightly different way, and then could be used as a newsletter while also still existing as something that can be used on the web as a web story, but also in the paper? Maybe it could be developed into a podcast, and it's about linking up all the different strands.
And does that happen now? Is that sort of organizing principle that it's really, repurposing is such a crappy word because it sounds like you're not putting any effort in, but you know what I mean? It's that idea that, create it once and use it in a bunch of different ways.
That's definitely a big part of what we do, and thinking about the ways in which our journalism can exist in lots of different places, in different ways for different audiences. But we also do produce things for newsletters which are very different from what we would do elsewhere and are kind of really built for that newsletter ecosystem. So this is a bit of a rubbish answer, but it's a bit of both. Very much, I'm personally very keen on the idea of let's use our journalism that we're producing in as many ways as possible, because that's how we'll reach as many different people. But we put a lot of effort into doing things that are very specifically for newsletters and work best in that medium.
How would you define that? How would you define something that works best as a newsletter?
So for me, I think about the way in which newsletters land with our readers, and they're coming straight to you in your inbox. Largely when they come from newsletters at The Guardian, when they're written by someone, I like them, if possible, to come literally from that person. Libby Brooks's name, who writes our first edition, pops up in your inbox. You're getting an email from her at 7 a.m. It feels a very personal thing, in some ways very intrusive, very different from a newspaper landing on your doormat or you clicking onto the website. This is something coming to you from a person, writing in a way that is more personable, that is more like you, that sounds like you. It's not strict kind of news objective style. It's a bit more of the writer's own self coming to the reader. Archie, I think, described it best when we were developing first edition, which is that it should be like a very smart mate in the pub talking to you, so that you can go away and you'll have some stuff that you can say at a dinner party or at a coffee or at work that makes you sound really smart when you're talking about what's happening with Keir Starmer or what's going to happen at the World Cup. You've got a bit of insight which makes you feel more informed, but it's come to you in a way that feels like it's come from a friend rather than from, The Guardian, this big newspaper, this monolith.
I'm trying to think who would be the people that had to make these decisions, but I mean, I guess it's Catherine and the editorial people, but you're kind of subsuming the masthead there to an individual. Was that a hard decision for some people to accept?
Yes, I think it is. And it's a big responsibility as well.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, those morning ones, which do cover the breadth of the news that we produce. When you're giving someone that responsibility and saying this is quite often going to be the first piece of Guardian journalism that someone interacts with on a daily basis, that's going out at 7 a.m. So you're giving that person that responsibility, then you need to make sure they're someone who you can trust to represent The Guardian in a really meaningful way. So it is a big responsibility. And yes, it is a challenge that it's a kind of constant tension, I think, actually, between promoting those individuals who you want to become names attached to newsletters while also maintaining The Guardian as a brand as something important. The thing that I always try and stress when I'm having those conversations internally is that The Guardian is massive. We should be really confident in that. We don't need to worry about one of our writers becoming bigger than we are. That is so unlikely to happen. We've been around for 200 years. None of our writers are going to be around for 200 years. So let's not worry about that. If we're making stars and making these people household names, then that's great for us and it's great for them. And we don't need to worry about that.
When you started with this in 2021, The Guardian might have had a bunch of newsletters, but it didn't have, a strategy as such. The last numbers I saw, you had over 50 newsletters. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're the man at the centre of that one. What was that like, growing that portfolio?
It was daunting. We already had quite a lot of newsletters when I started, but like I say, they were very low effort on the large, but they were automated. And so I kind of came in with this idea that, right, I'm going to strip it all back. We're going to have far fewer newsletters. A lot of these don't have a great deal of editorial worth. They're just replicating what someone can get on the website. And then you dig into it and you look at the statistics and you look at the open rates and the engagement. And actually, these things that aren't requiring a huge amount of investment from us are actually really well liked. Some people like just having the headlines in their inbox in the morning and not having to go to the website. So why would I get rid of that? And so then you end up adding things on top of that because you want to do different things. And then you end up with quite a large portfolio of things. But when you strip it back and you think, well, first of all, we've got a really massive global readership. So you've got your US office, your Australian office, your UK office, your Europe edition, international readers. So you've got newsletters which are reaching all of those different people for their own domestic consumption. And then you separate it into newsletters which are more link-based, those ones which are more about referral or about headlines, replicating what's on the website. And then you've got the ones which require more effort from a newsletter's desk and a team like I have in London, which require editing and commissioning. When it becomes more manageable when you think, okay, these ones largely I don't need to worry about. They manage themselves. These are the ones that I have to manage. So in the UK at the moment on desk, I think it's 12 or 13 that we have to manage kind of on a week-to-week, day-to-day basis. And then it becomes more manageable. But yes, it feels very sprawling. And I think one of the things which I haven't cracked yet, and we as The Guardian are going to be looking at, is how do we display the range to the right people at the right time? And we haven't cracked that yet, I would say.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because before we spoke, I had a look at The Guardian's newsletter page. It's quite overwhelming in some ways. There's so much stuff there. What am I going to choose?
Yeah, that's a page which we don't push people towards because it needs a bit of redesigning and
TLC.
Yeah, it needs some TLC. And then when it's had that, we'll be able to show it to more people. I think where we see a lot of signups coming from is not from that page, it's from promoting certain newsletters within articles that are related, so that if you're reading an article about the World Cup, you get shown a sign-up thing for a World Cup newsletter instead. And that's how you try and reach the right people in the right places. I would love a newsletter page which felt like more of a showcase of what we do. We actually did a hack which was quite fun recently, where they came up with a quiz that readers could answer about their interests, and then based on their answers to this quiz, you would get recommended one or two newsletters that feel like they fit your interests.
Yeah, I think that discoverability piece for any kind of media, whether it's podcasts, whether it's newsletters, even if it's just website stuff, it's a complicated thing, right? I'm looking at that as this, I'm interested in your newsletters, but that's not how a civilian finds a newsletter, right?
No.
They think I'm interested in football, or I'm interested in politics, or I'm interested in food. So it's that discoverability piece, I think, that's really interesting there.
And I think that's why that page hasn't been given the love that it needs. It's not been prioritized by the other things, because it's quite rare that that's the way in which a reader tries to find our newsletters. There aren't that many readers that will come to the Guardian website and be like, I want to sign up to some newsletters. So what actually happens is they read some stories about things that they like, and then they find our newsletters that way, hopefully. And, and in the US and the UK audience behave really differently, because far more of the UK audience are people that are coming directly to the Guardian website, whereas a lot of our US audience will be finding us through Apple News or through social things. And so they're coming to specific articles. And then it becomes really important to show those people the right newsletters to sign up to if they're not going to be coming to The Guardian as regularly, to make sure that we can help create that connection between us and them.
How do you join the dots on that? Is that about putting newsletter sign-ups in individual articles, or is it about putting sign-ups in types of articles?
My ambition would be that you would have a newsletter sign-up within every article on The Guardian. And that's what I push for. That way that there is a relevant newsletter shown to anyone that's reading any of our journalism would be my hope. And then it's about, currently it's a manual process whereby we choose which newsletter we promote within each article.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was trying to get at there. Can you just tag stuff, or do you actually have to go into every one of these articles?
So the way it works, I hope I'm not giving away any trade secrets. So the way it works at the moment is that we have various tags that we add to articles like football or US news and things like that. And there are tags for each newsletter sign up. And so as people are editing those articles, the hope is that they add to a football article, sign up to our Football Daily newsletter, for example. And it's suggested to them, they're prompted to add it when they add certain tags. So if you add a football tag, they'll prompt you to add the sign up for the football newsletter. And so it's a very manual process at the moment. And there's a world in which I think that becomes more automated and a bit smarter, so that a US and a UK reader reading the same article might be shown different newsletters.
So that's a great segue into the World Cup newsletter, which I'm guessing is for a US audience because it's about not knowing anything about the World Cup.
Yeah, and I think there's an immediate distinction when you're talking about promoting The Guardian's football coverage in the US, just on that very word. You know, if you talk about football in the US, you're not talking about soccer, you're not talking about the World Cup, you're talking about the NFL. So our main football newsletter is called Football Daily. Well, that doesn't really work in the US, just on a name basis. And then you've got a slightly complicated thing with Football Daily, in that it's one of our longest running written through newsletters. And it's got a very distinct style and tone, and it's got quite a lot of kind of inside jokes and long running jokes that if you're coming to it completely fresh might not necessarily translate. So we've thought very hard about how we do our soccer coverage in the US. We've got a big advantage, we think, in that we've got a lot of amazing football writers that have been doing it for years. And as the interest in the sport grows in the US, we're really well placed, we'd hope, to be a place that US readers come to. So we're investing in that. We've got new soccer editors and writers starting in the US around this World Cup. One of the things we are doing is a newsletter, which is I think it's called The World Behind the World Cup, which is a short run pop-up newsletter that's been running ahead of the World Cup. And then we're transitioning from that. Readers will be moving over to a new newsletter called Soccer Desk. And I think during the World Cup, it's going to be called World Cup Soccer Desk. And then after that, it will continue running as a weekly newsletter. You don't want to patronize readers. You know, there are a lot of very informed US soccer fans out there, but you do want to write about the sport in a slightly different way than you would for a UK Premier League audience. And so that's what this newsletter will do. It's not that it won't be of interest to UK readers, but it is written for the US audience. And I think just the name Soccer Desk, as soon as you put soccer in the title, you're telling people that it's aiming at a certain audience. And that's what we're hoping to do with these newsletters, is really take advantage of the interest around the sport that happens during this World Cup.
The Guardian's doing really well in the US, as well as it's ever done. Is this part of that idea of saying, okay, we've got this growing audience in the US, let's try and serve them with this real world, real time event? Is that the kind of philosophy behind that? Yeah,
we're doing really well with the US in all sorts of ways, especially around the politics coverage. And this is a kind of the next strand, I suppose. We'd already have a really engaged US audience with our sport coverage and our football coverage or soccer coverage. But we think this is a moment where if we invest in it, if we're adding editors, adding writers, adding resource, adding promotion, that we can capture some of that hype around the World Cup, basically.
I mean, one of my questions is this idea of pop-up newsletters. which I'd love. I think they're great. I think they're usually very timely or very specific, which is fantastic. But feels like there's a lot of investment going in there for a short run. And then what? What do you do next? After all that effort to get people to sign up, what do you do next?
In an ideal world, when you start a pop-up newsletter, you have already worked out where you're taking those readers after the end of that newsletter.
Right.
So with the World Cup pop-up, we know exactly where we're taking the readers at the end of that journey, and that's onto the Soccer Desk newsletter, which will be ongoing. So we maintain a relationship with those readers throughout and beyond the World Cup. It becomes more tricky when you're doing pop-ups around something which have a less obvious follow-on. And that's something that perhaps, something I've learned over the course of doing this job. We've had very successful pop-up newsletters. We do a lot of asynchronous newsletters, which are kind of short-run newsletters. Not a lot. We have done some and done some really successfully. So we'll do one that really caught fire in the US particularly was one called Reclaim Your Brain, which we did a couple of years ago. We did it in January, and it was about digital detox, but not quite as naff as that. Really interesting stuff, really useful. I think it was an 8-week newsletter. So whenever you sign up, you get issues 1 to 8, regardless of when you signed up. And we got hundreds of thousands of signups to that newsletter. We knew that we were going to recommend some newsletters to them at the end of it that would be ongoing to try and maintain that relationship. But if I'd thought about it more, and perhaps if we'd realised how successful it was going to be, we'd have thought, right, is there a newsletter that we would be allowed to move them onto automatically as opposed to recommend? We take data privacy incredibly seriously at The Guardian, and so passing email addresses from one list to another isn't something we can just do in a way that perhaps some other publishers might. So having those conversations early at the point at which you're coming up with the idea for a newsletter, I think is really important. And it was a missed opportunity with something like Reclaim Your Brain, but it's something which we thought about from the start when we were coming up with the World Cup coverage. And that's partly where Soccer Desk comes from, is making sure we can maintain those relationships, because the what next is crucial.
You're almost building a standard operating procedure on the fly. It's like, oh, we learned this, so let's do that next time. We learned this, let's do that next time. And you're developing it as you go.
Yeah, very much so. Coming into this job fresh with no predecessor means that that's inevitable to a degree.
Blessing and a curse.
Yeah. But I'm also really keen to stress throughout The Guardian, we may be an institution that's been around for a long, long time, but we should be constantly experimenting and trying new things. And sometimes they'll fail, and that's fine, because when they fail, you learn things from it, and then the next time you do it better. And I think what paralyzes big organizations and long-running organizations is when you start being too afraid to experiment, too afraid of failure, and then you never learn, you never grow, you never change, and that's when you get left behind. I'm perfectly happy to try something and not to work and then learn from it. And there have been things that we've done that, didn't work, and that's totally fine. But we tried it and we move on and we learn from it. And I want everyone in The Guardian to do that, not just me on newsletters. I think people that are in jobs, the news editor, that's a job which has existed since The Guardian has existed. But that person should still be experimenting with things, trying new formats and testing things out. And then if they don't work, that's fine.
On the pop-ups, is sponsorship a part of that? Do you go into these things thinking, oh, we can get someone to pay for this from a sponsorship point of view?
So we at The Guardian are very editorial led. We're never led like directly by commercial considerations. We would never launch a newsletter because a sponsor came to us and were like, right, could you do a newsletter which is about gardening and then we'll give you $100,000. It's not the way around that we work here. I know it is. It's how other publishers might do it. But especially with newsletters, I've been really keen to work very closely with commercial and make sure that we are looped in and talking to each other throughout. I think sometimes what's happened is because we're editorial led, you get this separation between editorial and commercial, which isn't helpful. Whereas I like to have commercial people in regular meetings so they know what we're doing, so that if we are starting a new pop-up, they know that they can go out to clients and say, we're about to launch this new thing. Would you like to be a launch sponsor on it?
Yeah.
it would be great to have sponsorship on all our newsletters. And I want The Guardian to make money because that's how it continues to exist and do the great journalism it does. So I'm not someone that's afraid of that or thinks it compromises what we do. But it wouldn't be that we would start something necessarily going, right, I think we could launch this and that'll make us lots of money. It's kind of the other way around, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. I mean, I guess the whole point with that is you start with your readers. And if you don't take care of the readers, then the sponsors aren't going to get the reaction that they want anyway. So I absolutely get that. Money aside, what makes a good... Well, I was going to say what makes a good pop-up newsletter, but actually what makes a good newsletter? Just in terms of, again, crappy word, but KPIs and success factors.
The things we're looking for in terms of those KPIs, the indicators that something's doing well are kind of, there's obvious things like sign-up rate, churn, how many people are unsubscribing, open rate, although that's an imperfect metric now because you've got the automatic opens, but it allows you at least a comparison between newsletters, if not an absolute idea of how many people are opening. Click-through rate is something I talked about at the beginning of this conversation of deprioritizing, but it's still an useful engagement metric. So even with our newsletters, which are meant to be enjoyed and read in your inbox, like all of them will contain links to The Guardian journalism elsewhere. And so seeing how they do in terms of click-through gives us an idea of how much people are reading, how far down they're getting, and things like that. So that's something we look for. Those are the main ones, I would say. And then we operate with a reader-funded model, and so reader revenue is something which we look at again as another engagement factor. It's not the overriding thing, and we're quite unusual in that most Guardian editors don't have sight of those reader revenue figures, but on newsletters we do because it's just a useful piece of engagement tracking that we have. But in terms of how you make those things go up, if I knew the answer to that, the open rate in some ways, subject lines are the most important thing, making sure you've got something which is really clicky to make people actually open that email, then click-through rate, putting in, I don't know how you drive that. You can put lots of links in, but if they're not the right ones to things that people are interested in, it's not going to work. Also, it can be a curse if you're trying to make people read something within their inbox and you've got links in the wrong places. You're driving people off the thing you want them to read. But in terms of how you grow signups, I wish I knew the answer to that because it's a mystery to me sometimes. We did a big piece of research around the time when I started, and the thing that people said they wanted more than anything else was a TV newsletter. So that was like, okay, right, well, that's an easy thing to do. We've got lots of great TV writers. We've got lots of great TV content we want to produce. Let's do a TV newsletter. And we launched it, and it never took off. And I don't know the reason to why. We've tried a few different ways of doing it, and it's still never flown in the way that I might have liked. And I don't know why. It's still going. It's got an audience which is a decent sized audience that likes what we're doing, but it's not been this massive hit that I would have suspected it would have been at the start. It's a really tricky thing. We launch a lot of our newsletters on site, and we can see individual issues of the newsletter might do hundreds of thousands of clicks on the website, and they've all got very prominent sign-up things to sign up to the newsletter that you're reading on the website. But there doesn't seem to be any correlation between how well it performs on the website and then the number of people that choose to sign up to it afterwards. So it really is somewhat of a mystery to me how you make people take that step.
Do you think that takes you back, though, to the idea it's not just about data, it's about editorial instinct?
Always. It's always about instinct. It's always, people can tell you what they want, but they don't always know exactly what they want. And so you have to trust that we have people in the building that have some feel for what's going to work. And I lean on that a lot. I also, because newsletters create that personal connection between readers and writers and editors, that qualitative data in terms of the feedback that we're getting from our readers who are already signed up is really helpful. I know I've encouraged everyone that writes our newsletters to include elements of reader interactivity within all of them. And that's really important to me. And we have newsletters which have, Pushing Buttons is a great example of this. This is our gaming newsletter by Keza McDonald. Yeah. It's a brilliant newsletter. She's a great writer. The audience we have for it is quite small. Well, it's at a level where I'm considering, is this worth the amount of effort and investment we're putting into it? But if I was looking at the data, I might go, maybe this isn't worth carrying on. But then you look at the amount of reader interaction there is, the engagement on that list is huge. The people that are signed up to that newsletter love it. They are constantly emailing in. There's conversations between Keza and the readers, and they're readers who wouldn't necessarily be signing up to anything else we do. And we've done surveys, and we know that that newsletter skews a good deal younger than the rest of our list. It skews more female than a lot of the rest of our list. This is fantastic. This is really valuable people to have engaging with The Guardian. And so we carry on with it and we invest in it, and we're going to try and boost that community with other things that we can do around it. And just looking at the data wouldn't tell you that. You need to look at the ways in which the audience is engaging with the writer on it as well. And because email allows that kind of conversation that you wouldn't otherwise get, we need to lean on that and trust that as well.
So my last question for you was actually, what makes a perfect newsletter? And you've kind of just blown a hole in that question because there's no such thing, right?
No, there's no such thing as a perfect newsletter. Each individual will have a newsletter that they would like more than another, I suppose. The important thing for me with a newsletter, what makes a newsletter that's great for me, is one where the writer is having a good time writing it. They are interested in the subject. They are engaged in the subject. They are really informed, or they're talking to people and giving people information that they wouldn't get elsewhere. I'm going to lean on the Keza example again because she's so great at it. She loves writing what she is writing. It comes across in what she's doing. There are people on my newsletters team in London who would say themselves they're not interested in gaming at all. It's not a subject they care about, but they enjoy reading that newsletter every week because the enthusiasm Keza has for her subject comes across in the way she writes. And it allows her to write in a way that she wouldn't if she was just writing news stories or features for the website. And that, to me, is what makes a perfect newsletter. It should be actually really interesting for people that wouldn't otherwise be interested in that subject. Yeah. And allowing the enthusiasm of our writers to come across to our readers is really important to me. I think we straitjacket people often by making them write in very strict formats and in ways that we think are the kind of correct way for a news organization to write. And newsletters allows people to break out of that slightly, and you can see different aspects of our writers and you can feel the passion they have for the topics they cover, and you can really feel the expertise that they have. And I want our readers to get that insight into our newsroom and into our journalists. Readers love understanding how it is that we do our jobs. What seems obvious to us isn't always obvious to them. And some of that can come across in the newsletters in a way that it wouldn't in a news story too. And it's those relationships, it's that communion between journalist and reader that makes a newsletter great, I think.
Thanks to Toby for joining us on the podcast. If you want the key learnings from this in writing, head to voices.media, make sure you're signed up for a newsletter, get it straight to your inbox every Tuesday, and as Toby would describe it, that's a written through newsletter that you can read more or less exclusively in your inbox. Next week's guest is Heather Dietrich, Chief Media Officer at Outside Inc. I'm looking forward to this one. I've known Outside magazine forever. It was a case study when I was at journalism school about 1 million years ago.
And of course, our Publisher Summit and Awards, that's the Podcast and Newsletter Awards, are coming up in July the 8th.
I haven't mentioned that
No,
before.
not at all. The tickets, speakers, agenda, everything else are all live over at publishersummits.com. If newsletters are your bag, and again, I assume if you're still listening, they are very much your bag, there is plenty on the agenda, from how free-to-read startup The Nerve smashed their paying subscriber targets, to how newsletters supercharge other areas of a publishing business. And I think probably the one I'm looking forward to doing most, there is a panel on publishing to other places like LinkedIn and Substack, what the opportunities are and what some of the pitfalls might be.
Until then, keep up with all things Media Voices by following us on LinkedIn and subscribing to the Publisher newsletter over on voices.media.
Goodbye.
Bye.